Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. I woke up gasping, my chest tight, as if something had just slipped out of my grasp, some fleeting, forgotten nightmare. My bedroom was dark, save for the pale glow of the street lamp seeping through the curtains. The apartment was silent, and yet I felt it, the weight of a gaze, someone watching. Slowly I turned my head toward the window, my breath hitched. There, standing on the front lawn, barefoot in the frost-covered grass, was me. I froze. My own face stared back at me from the darkness outside, illuminated by the yellowish light. She wasn't just standing there, she was smiling. Not a normal smile, but something stretched too far, held too long, as if she'd forgotten how to let it go. My pulse roared in my ears. I reached for my phone on the nightstand with trembling hands, fumbling to open the camera. My fingers were clumsy, but I managed to snap a picture. My other self didn't move. I forced myself to breathe, to move. With slow, deliberate motions, I peeled back the blankets and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The air was cold against my skin. I didn't take my eyes off her as I reached for my phone again, this time opening the security app linked to the camera on my front door. A motion alert flashed across the screen. Movement detected, 3:14 a.m. With a sharp inhale, I clicked on the notification and waited. The footage loaded, grainy but clear. My hands clenched as I prepared to see myself standing outside. But there was nothing. The lawn was empty. No footprints in the frost, no shadowy figure. Just the quiet street, the distant glow of streetlights, and the faint rustling of trees in the wind. I glanced up from the phone, back to the window. She was gone. My stomach twisted into knots. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window, pressing my hands against the cold glass. The street was empty, the frost-covered grass undisturbed. I checked my phone again. The screenshot I'd taken earlier was still there, my own face outside, smiling up at me. But when I tapped the image, something was different. The smile was gone, and the reflection of my bedroom window in the photo. There was someone standing behind me. Morning came in a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, me, standing on the lawn, watching, smiling. The photo on my phone hadn't changed again, but I deleted it anyway, as if that could erase the wrongness of it all. I told myself I was just tired. Sleep deprivation could do strange things. But the unease didn't fade. The subway was packed, as usual, a sea of faces too preoccupied with their own lives to notice me clenching my hands in my lap. The rhythmic clatter of the train tracks did little to settle my nerves. Then I saw it, my reflection in the window. For a moment it looked normal, my tired face, my scarf wrapped around my neck, the slight furrow of my brow. But something was wrong. The coat was different. My reflection wore the same color, the same cut, but a different style. The buttons off-center, the fabric a little thicker. My real coat hadn't changed, just the one in the reflection. My breath hitched. I jerked my gaze away, pulse hammering. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the smudged glass distorted the image, playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't stop myself. I looked back. My reflection was grinning. Not a natural smile, not a polite one. It was stretched too wide, too fixed, as if my face had forgotten how to not smile. I slapped my hand over my mouth instinctively. My real mouth. The one that wasn't smiling. My reflection didn't mimic me. It just stared. I lurched up from my seat, gripping the subway pole for balance. My knees felt weak. My breath came in short gasps. And that's when I saw her. Across the train, standing near the doors, was another me. She wasn't a reflection, she was real. Flesh and blood. Same face, same hair, same everything. Except her eyes weren't filled with fear. They were focused, watching me. I couldn't move. She raised a hand, just slightly, almost like a test, tilting her head ever so slightly to the side, a mirror of my own movement. train lurched to a stop. A robotic voice announced the next station. In the time it took me to blink, she was gone. The subway doors slid open. The crowd bustled past me. I turned, scanning every face, searching for her, but there was no one. No copy, no grin. Only my reflection in the window. And this time, it wasn't smiling. I rushed home as soon as work ended, my nerves stretched so tight I felt like they might snap. All day, I had felt watched. Every reflective surface seemed off. Storefront windows, puddles on the sidewalk, the glass walls of the office lobby. I stopped checking them altogether. I was too afraid I'd see something that wasn't supposed to be there. By the time I locked my apartment door behind me, my hands were shaking. It's fine, I'm fine. I pulled out my phone to distract myself. Scrolling mindlessly through my camera roll, I almost convinced myself that the morning had been some waking dream. Then I saw the photo. A selfie. I stopped breathing. I didn't remember taking it. It was me standing in my apartment, this very room, the lighting, the angle, even the clothes I was wearing right now, except it wasn't right. The eyes were too dark, not just shadowed, hollow, as if the pupils had swallowed everything. My lips were curled into a strange, stiff smile, like something barely pretending to be human. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Had I taken this in my sleep? Had someone else? My thumb hovered over the screen, stomach twisting in knots. Then the photo glitched. The image warped, streaking across my screen like a corrupted file. My face twisted unnaturally, elongated, grinning wider than before, the mouth stretching too far. Then it was gone, deleted. I opened my gallery, frantically scrolling back. It wasn't there. The space where it had been was just empty. My pulse thundered in my ears. This wasn't my imagination. It couldn't be. I quickly navigated to my cloud backup. If the photo had been real, it should have saved automatically. But when I checked the most recent files, there was nothing new. No record of the image at all, but there was something else. An old group photo from months ago, taken at a friend's birthday dinner. I barely remembered it, but when I tapped to enlarge the image, my breath turned to ice. In the background, behind my friends, barely noticeable in the dim lighting, a face, my face, peeking from behind a doorway, staring directly at the camera. I didn't remember seeing it before. I knew it hadn't been there before. I dropped my phone, the screen still glowing. Outside my window, something moved, a shadow shifting, waiting, watching. I didn't sleep, I tried, but every time I shut my eyes, I felt them. Not just watching, closer now, inside. By 3 a.m., exhaustion blurred into paranoia. Every creak of my apartment, every hum of the heater sent ice through my veins. My mind twisted shadows into shapes, silence into whispers. And then, a sound, a soft, distant murmur. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from inside the walls. I told myself it was nothing, pipes maybe, a neighbor's TV. Then I heard it again, clearer, my voice, a whisper just behind the drywall, faint but unmistakably mine. My stomach knotted. I forced myself up, every nerve in my body screaming. The sound was coming from the far side of the room, just beside the bookshelf. I moved toward it slowly, my bare feet silent against the floor. The closer I got, the clearer the whisper became, soft, insistent, repeating me. I hesitated, every cell in my body screaming, "Don't do it." But I pressed my ear to the wall. At first, nothing. Then, shallow breathing, a perfect mirrored match to mine. I clamped a hand over my mouth. My skin turned to ice as I listened, heart hammering. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't in my head. It was real. And then it spoke. "Can you hear me?" My voice. I jerked back, my heel slamming into the bookshelf, sending a few books tumbling. My pulse roared in my ears. The whispering stopped. A horrible, suffocating silence filled the room. And then, a soft scratching, something moving inside the walls. I backed away, shaking my head. No, this wasn't possible. And yet, thump. A single deliberate knock from the other side. Then another and another. The knocks followed my breathing. I clamped my hands over my ears, panic clawing up my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand here and listen. But then, in the silence, came the worst sound yet. A soft laugh. My laugh. But I wasn't laughing. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment I was sitting on my bed, every light in my apartment blazing, my phone gripped in my trembling hands. The next, darkness. I was on the floor. My head ached like I had been dropped from a great height. The air was thick and wrong, like I had woken up somewhere I didn't belong. I groggily reached for my phone, fingers stiff and uncooperative. The screen flared to life, blinding me in the dim room. My heart lurched at the sight. I had been texting someone. A half-typed message filled the screen. "Help me. I don't know which one I am." A cold, slow horror spread through my limbs. I didn't remember writing that. My throat was dry. I tried to swallow, but my body felt foreign, distant, like it wasn't quite mine. Then I saw the time. 6:37 a.m. I had lost 6 hours. I bolted upright, my pulse hammering. What had I been doing? Where had I gone? My apartment looked the same. Dim morning light filtering through the curtains. Shadows stretched long across the floor. I checked my call log. No outgoing calls. My texts? No messages sent. But when I opened my recent apps, my stomach twisted into knots. My security camera app was open. I clicked on the last recorded motion alert. A cold weight settled over my ribs. The timestamp was 3:14 a.m., the exact time I had last been awake. I hit play. At first there was nothing, just my dimly lit apartment captured from the corner of the living room. No movement, no signs of life. Then, a figure stepped into frame. I choked on a breath. It was me. Barefoot, expressionless, moving slowly as if testing each step. The footage showed me walking to the front door. My hand hesitated on the lock, fingers twitching before I turned not towards the camera but toward the wall. My lips moved. I was talking to something inside the walls. The audio was silent, no words, no sound at all. And then I turned, looking directly into the camera. The screen flickered and the footage glitched. When it came back, the door was wide open and I was gone. My stomach twisted into knots. The footage ended there. No return, no sign of me coming back inside. But I was here now, wasn't I? I needed air. My skin felt tight, my own body unfamiliar. I had to get out, away, before the walls started whispering again. The morning was cold and gray as I rushed down the sidewalk, my breath visible in the air. I kept my head down, my thoughts racing. Had I sleepwalked? Had I blacked out? Had it really been me that left my apartment last night? I didn't know anymore. Work was a blur. I kept catching glimpses of my reflection in the office windows, too slow, too fast, out of sync, until I stopped looking altogether. My coworkers' voices felt distant, muffled, like I was hearing them from underwater. The hours dragged, and when my shift ended, I practically ran home. My building looked the same. My door looked the same. The lock clicked open under my trembling fingers. But the second I stepped inside, something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier, thicker. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, my couch, my bookshelf, my dining table. Everything was here, but not quite right. The couch was slightly askew, just a few inches to the left. The books on my shelf were out of order. My rug had been shifted, its edges curled slightly upward. A single framed photograph sat on my coffee table. A picture of my parents and me, taken years ago. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and my stomach plummeted. I wasn't in the photo. My parents were there, standing in the same sunlit park, their arms wrapped around. Nothing. The space where I should have been was empty. I staggered back, my legs weak. No, this isn't my apartment. A sound broke the silence. Water. The shower was running. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't alone. I took a step toward the bathroom, pulse roaring in my ears. The door was slightly ajar, steam curling from the gap. I forced myself forward. My fingers trembled as I pushed the door open. The steam was thick, obscuring the figure inside. Then she stepped out, dripping wet, wrapped in my towel, my face, my body, my eyes. She didn't look surprised to see me. She smiled, like she'd been expecting me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. She tilted her head, water dripping from her chin. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, familiar. "Oh, you're back." I couldn't move. She stood there, wrapped in my towel, in my bathroom, in my home, smiling like she'd been waiting for me. The air was thick with steam, but I could see her clearly. The way she blinked too slowly, the way her lips stayed curved just a little too long. She was me, but she wasn't. My legs finally unlocked and I stumbled back into the living room. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. This isn't happening. This isn't real. Footsteps, soft, bare, approaching. I turned and ran out the door, down the hallway. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I tore down the stairwell, nearly tripping over my own feet. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the cold air like I was drowning. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. No service. Panic clawed up my throat. I turned, scanning the street, and froze. They were everywhere. On the sidewalk, in doorways, behind windows, copies, versions of me. They weren't doing anything, just standing, watching. Some were almost identical. Others were wrong. One was too tall, her limbs stretched unnaturally long. Another had blackened gums visible between parted lips, her teeth too white, too perfect. A third had a head tilted at an impossible angle, like her neck had been snapped, but she didn't notice. They lined the street, watching, waiting. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This isn't real. It can't be real. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a reflection in the window of a parked car. I turned toward it, horrified, desperate. Maybe my reflection was still normal, maybe I was still me. But the moment I looked, my reflection didn't move. It just stared at me. Then slowly, mechanically, it lifted a hand. Fingers bent at odd angles like broken twigs. It pointed directly at me and grinned. I stumbled back, slamming into something, someone. A hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, another me, up close now, her face inches from mine. She leaned in, her breath cold. Her lips barely moved when she whispered, "You don't belong here." Then, every single one of them smiled. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, away from the copies, away from their smiles that stretched too wide, from their empty watching eyes. My breath burned in my throat as I sprinted down the sidewalk, weaving between strangers who didn't seem to notice the wrongness around them. No one reacted to the duplicates, to the way they lined the streets like mannequins. I needed help. I dug my phone out of my pocket, hands trembling as I called my best friend Rachel. She'd know me. She'd help me. The phone rang. Once, twice. She picked up. "Hello?" I exhaled, relief flooding through me. "Rachel. Rach, it's me. Something's wrong. Who is this?" I stopped walking. Her voice was different, cold, uncertain. "It's me," I said, my own voice unsteady. It's me." Silence. Then, "I don't know you." The line went dead. A numb, hollow feeling spread through me. No. I tried again. Her number was gone. I pulled up my contacts. Empty. Panic clawed at my throat. I ran to the nearest store, bursting through the doors. I just needed to see someone, anyone who knew me. The cashier gave me a bored glance as I approached. "Hey, can you scan my card?" I fumbled for my wallet, shoving my credit card toward him. "Please, just tell me my name." He raised an eyebrow, but swiped the card. The register beeped, declined. "Try again," I said quickly, shoving it forward. Another beep, declined. "Ma'am," the cashier said, his tone shifting, "are you sure this is yours?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Is this yours?" I pulled out my driver's license, holding it up to him. "It's me. Look, my name, I stopped. The ID photo wasn't mine. The face was different. Same eyes, same nose, same lips. But it wasn't me. The name beneath it, not mine. A cold wave of nausea surged through me. I dropped the card and bolted for the exit. I needed to see my own reflection. I sprinted past storefronts, searching for my face in the glass. But when I finally caught a glimpse, the me in the reflection stood perfectly still, not mirroring my movements, not moving at all. And then, she blinked. I stumbled backward, away from the glass. My reflection hadn't moved with me. It stayed still, frozen in place until it didn't. Her head tilted, not a natural tilt, but a slow, deliberate shift, too sharp, too calculated. Then, as if she had been waiting for this moment, she smiled. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. My apartment wasn't safe. The streets weren't safe. My own reflection wasn't safe. I took the stairs 2 at a time, slamming through my apartment door, locking it behind me. My lungs burned. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. What's happening to me? I pressed my back against the door, chest heaving. I needed to think. I needed a knock from the window. My stomach dropped. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head. The copies were outside, lining the street, standing in my yard, filling the sidewalk, all of them, staring, waiting. Another knock, this time from the wall, then the ceiling, then the inside of my closet. Knock, knock, knock. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking. This isn't real, this isn't real. But it was. A voice, not just one, many. All of them, speaking at once. You took too long. We've been waiting. Which one are you? I screamed. Lights flickered. The apartment shook. The voices grew louder, overlapping, suffocating. Something moved in the hallway, a shadow, shifting. The air was thick, suffocating, wrong. A wave of dizziness hit me, my vision blurred. The knocking pounded in my skull, my ribs, my skin. The walls stretched. The voices merged into one, and then nothing. Silence, darkness, a weightlessness, like floating, like sinking, like waking up. A slow, rhythmic beeping, sterile white light. A heavy weight in my limbs, like I'd been buried alive. I tried to move, but my body felt wrong. My arms didn't respond the way they should. My fingers twitched, sluggish, uncooperative. The scent of disinfectant filled my nose. I wasn't home. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. A soft gasp came from nearby. Footsteps, hurried, approaching. A voice, shaking with emotion. Oh my God, you're awake. I turned my head, every movement thick and delayed. A woman in scrubs was at my bedside, her wide eyes brimming with relief. A nurse. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my tongue sluggish. She rushed to the hallway, calling out, "Doctor, doctor, she's awake." A rush of footsteps followed. A man in a white coat entered, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes studied me with intensity. "Welcome back," he said. "We weren't sure if we'd ever see you wake up." I swallowed hard. My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Where?" "You're in St. Luke's Hospital," he said gently. "You've been in a coma for 3 months." The room tilted. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. No, I had been awake. I had been living. My apartment, my job, the copies, the whispers. It had been real, hadn't it? The doctor continued, his voice low, careful. "You suffered a dissociative fugue state," he said, "a rare condition. You fractured, your mind created alternate identities, and you disappeared into them. But now," he smiled, "now you're finally back." A slow, crawling dread settled in my gut, because he was wrong. The one who had gone under, the original me, wasn't here anymore. I was. And I remembered everything. The reflections, the whispers, the doppelgangers who weren't just illusions, they were real. I had been one of them. I met the doctor's gaze. I smiled, slow, wide, unnatural. He didn't notice. No one did, because I had taken her place, and no one would ever know. It started, as these things always do, with a stupid dare. Ryan was the one who suggested it. They were sitting at a booth in a dingy little diner on the edge of town, nursing milkshakes and fries, when he leaned in with that grin, the one that meant trouble. "Come on," he said, eyes flicking between them. "Let's go check it out." Mark groaned. "Dude, no one actually goes in there." "Exactly," Ryan said, as if that proved his point. "It's been abandoned for years. We sneak in, take a few pictures, and leave. 5 minutes tops." Emily shifted uncomfortably, stirring the last of her melted vanilla shake with her straw. "People say that place is haunted." Jessica rolled her eyes. "People say a lot of things. It's probably just asbestos and some homeless guy pissing in the hallways." Mark sighed, rubbing his temple. He knew better. He'd heard the stories, the disappearances, the strange noises at night, the way the doors never seemed to be in the same place twice. But he also knew Ryan wouldn't let it go. And if Ryan was going, Jessica would too. And if Jessica went, Emily wouldn't want to be the only one chickening out. And if Emily went, well, Mark wasn't about to be the one to stay behind. So, at 11:34 p.m., they parked at the edge of the crumbling school grounds, the place looming like a corpse under the streetlights. "Looks like something straight out of a horror movie," Mark muttered. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the school, but there was a gaping hole near the west side. The 4 of them slipped through, their sneakers crunching against dead leaves and cracked pavement. They crept toward a broken window on the first floor, its glass long since shattered. Ryan went first, hoisting himself up and sliding through, then reached back to help Jessica. Mark followed, pulling Emily up after him. The moment they landed inside, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as if the building itself was breathing. Dust hung in the moonlight, and every sound, every footstep, every creak seemed unnaturally loud. "Okay," Jessica whispered. "We're in 5 minutes, then we're out. Or whoever runs out first has to buy our booze for the whole month, deal?" Ryan said, already grinning like a madman. The others groaned but agreed in the end. They moved cautiously through the ruined hallways, stepping over broken desks and old textbooks that had been left to rot. Faint graffiti covered the walls, names, obscene doodles, warnings. Then something whispered. It was distant, barely there. A breeze through the empty halls, maybe. The kind of thing that would have been easy to ignore if it hadn't been for the way it felt. Like it had shape, direction, intent. Emily froze. "Did you hear that?" Ryan smirked. "The ghosts are saying hi." Mark swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder. The corridor behind them was empty. Just shadows stretching long under the flickering emergency light. Another whisper, closer this time. "All right," Jessica said, her voice a little too forceful. "Let's just..." A floorboard creaked at the end of the hall. Mark turned, and someone was standing there, a figure, shadowy, motionless, too tall, too still. His breath caught in his throat. Then the figure moved, not walked, moved. Too fast, too sudden, rushing toward them in a blur of darkness. Mark's stomach dropped. His brain screamed, "Run!" He squeezed his eyes shut. And everything stopped. Dead silence. When he forced himself to look, the hallway was empty again. "Guys," Mark croaked, "we need to get out of here." But when they turned toward the exit, the door was gone. Mark's breath hitched. The door, the way they had come in, was gone. Not locked, not blocked, just missing. Ryan cursed under his breath, stepping forward and pressing his palms flat against the cold wall where the exit had been. "No way, no way, this isn't real. We came through here. The door was right here." Jessica's voice wavered. "Maybe we got turned around. Maybe we took a wrong turn." Emily was shaking her head violently. No, I don't think we did." Mark took a slow step back, his mind racing. It wasn't just the door. Something about the hallway itself felt different now, like it had stretched just a little too long. The walls seemed farther apart, the air heavier. The silence rang in his ears, oppressive, waiting. Ryan turned, his face twisting into a forced grin. "All right, guys. Haha, great prank. If one of you is screwing with us, seriously, cut the shit." Nobody laughed. "Okay," Jessica said, forcing an exhale. "We just need to find another way out. There's got to be an emergency exit, right?" No one wanted to argue with that. They turned and started walking. The hallway was endless, stretching forward into the dark, lined with classroom doors. Some open, some barely hanging on their hinges. Mark's stomach clenched as something flickered in his peripheral vision. He turned his head, heart hammering. There was someone at the end of the hall, a shadowy figure still as a statue. No features, no eyes, just standing there, watching. Mark's throat went dry. "Guys, don't look behind us." Ryan, of course, did exactly that, and then he froze. His entire body went rigid, his breath catching in his throat like he'd just seen something he wasn't supposed to. Jessica and Emily spun around, their sharp intakes of breath the only confirmation Mark needed. The figure was closer now, too close. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Ryan's voice came out hoarse. "We need to go, now." They turned on their heels and ran, boots slamming against the rotted tile, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The hallway blurred past them, doors, desks, darkened windows. Then Jessica let out a sharp cry. Mark twisted to see her fall, tripping over the jagged remains of a broken desk leg. Ryan and Emily skidded to a stop, rushing to help her up. Mark turned his head. The shadow was right there, less than 10 feet away, and it was moving, not walking, not running, just sliding forward as if gravity didn't quite apply to it. A black blur, a rush of cold air, then nothing. Mark clamped his eyes shut, his heart hammering, his breath barely contained in his chest. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Emily let out a strangled whisper. "It's gone." Mark forced himself to look. The hallway was empty. Jessica scrambled to her feet. I don't like this. I don't like this at all. Ryan swallowed. Let's get the hell out of here. Now. They ran. Again. But something had changed. The halls felt unfamiliar now, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. There was no logic to them, no structure. Just endless corridors stretching into the dark, turning back on themselves like a maze designed to confuse. And worst of all, the whispers were getting louder. The whispers crawled into their ears like insects. Faint at first, just a murmur. Then louder, urgent, desperate. Mark kept moving, heart hammering in his chest as they rounded another corner. The school should have been simple. One long hallway lined with classrooms, a few branching halls leading to the cafeteria, gym, and faculty offices. But this wasn't right. They had run straight. They should have been near the entrance by now. Instead, the walls stretched into endless darkness. Jessica stopped suddenly, sucking in a sharp breath. Wait, Ryan nearly collided into her. What? Why'd you stop? Jessica pointed. A classroom door stood open, just a crack. It hadn't been there a second ago. The four of them stared at it. A draft seeped through the gap, the air colder than the rest of the hallway. Emily whispered, Maybe there's a window in there. Maybe we can get out. Mark didn't like it, not one bit. But what other choice did they have? With shaky steps, he reached out and pushed the door open. The classroom was frozen in time. Dust-covered desks sat in neat rows, like students had just walked out one day and never returned. Old textbooks lay open, their pages yellowed and brittle, and on the walls, paintings, at least 20 of them lined up in a perfect row. Portraits of students, their faces eerily detailed, frozen in mid-smile. The hairs on Mark's arms stood on end. Something about them felt wrong. Jessica stepped inside, scanning the room. Okay, this is weird. Ryan snorted. Yeah, no shit. Emily inched closer to the paintings, hugging her arms. Why are they still here? Shouldn't they have been taken down when the school closed? Ryan leaned in, inspecting one. Damn, these look real. Too real. Mark's stomach churned. The paintings were so lifelike, down to the fine brushstrokes on their skin, the glint of light in their eyes. It was as if one of the eyes moved. Mark's breath caught. He saw it. A flicker, barely there, a shifting of the pupils, then another and another. A ripple ran through the paintings as every pair of eyes snapped to them. Emily gasped. Did you see that? Did you? The eyes kept moving, shifting, watching, following them. Jessica clamped a hand over her mouth. Ryan stepped back, knocking into a desk. The eyes weren't just following them now. The faces in the paintings were changing. Mouths stretching, warping, grins widening too far, revealing too many teeth. Their once innocent smiles contorted into something grotesque. Mark's vision blurred. The whispers surged. A high-pitched wail filled the room, sharp as glass. Emily clutched her head. Make it stop! Make it stop! Then Ryan's voice cut through the chaos. Guys, look at this. Mark turned, pulse thrumming in his ears. Ryan was holding an old notebook, its cover cracked with age. He flipped to the last page. A half-finished test, its handwriting neat, until the last few lines. The words shifted into a frantic scrawl. Don't look at them. They can only hurt you when you look at them. Don't look up. Don't look up. Silence fell. Emily's lip quivered. What does that mean? Ryan exhaled. I don't know, but I think we should... A creaking sound above them. Mark's gut twisted with dread. He didn't want to look, but Ryan did. And when Ryan tilted his head back, he saw it. A grinning face pressed against the ceiling. Ryan made a horrible sound, a mix between a gasp and a strangled scream. Mark didn't want to look up. Didn't need to. He saw it reflected in Ryan's wide, horrified eyes. A face, grinning, its mouth too wide, lips stretched thin over jagged, irregular teeth. Its skin was gray, waxy, wrong. The eyes were black pits, but Mark swore they were watching, seeing. Ryan stumbled back, nearly tripping over a desk. His voice came out as a broken whisper. Oh God, oh God, oh God. Jessica yanked him back, squeezing her eyes shut. Don't look at it. Mark swallowed, his hands clenched into fists. Don't look up. The words on the notebook burned in his brain. Emily was shaking beside him. I don't understand. What happens if we... The whispers surged, flooding the air, wrapping around them like fingers against their throats. Mark clenched his jaw. We need to get out of this room, now. Ryan's breath was ragged. How? If we move, we might... A soft thump echoed from above, like something had dropped down. Emily made a choking sound, gripping Mark's sleeve. The air had turned ice cold. Mark squeezed his eyes shut. Don't open them. Don't open them. Their footsteps were unsteady as they moved toward the door, hands stretched blindly in front of them. Something shifted in the room, a scraping sound. The chairs, no, something else, something moving. Mark's heart hammered so hard he swore it was shaking his ribs. Jessica fumbled for the door handle. Come on, come on. Her fingers wrapped around it. She yanked. The door wouldn't budge. Ryan let out a shaky breath. Oh, you have got to be kidding me, Emily whimpered. Try again. Jessica pulled. The door groaned. The paintings laughed. A guttural, wet sound like choked giggles forcing their way through locked jaws. Mark squeezed his eyes shut harder. Don't look, don't look. Jessica yanked with everything she had. The door burst open. They stumbled through the threshold, slamming it shut behind them. For a long moment, none of them spoke, just stood there, breathing like they had run a marathon. Then Ryan shuddered. We are so beyond screwed. Jessica braced herself against the wall, her fingers trembling. We need to get out of here, now. Mark nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. The air in the hallway was just as thick, just as wrong, but at least they weren't in there. Then Emily let out a soft, barely audible whisper. Guys, the paintings? Mark turned, and his stomach dropped, because the paintings were still watching. The door they had just slammed shut had a tiny dust-covered window, and through it, a row of distorted faces peered out at them, grinning. Mark yanked his gaze away from the door, bile rising in his throat. They were still watching. The twisted faces, the grotesque smiles, pressed against the tiny window like animals in a cage. Keep moving, Jessica whispered. Just don't look at them. Emily was shaking, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I don't understand. What is this place? Why is it doing this? Ryan ran a hand through his hair, eyes darting wildly. I don't know, but I'm about 5 seconds from punching through a damn window and crawling out of here. Mark swallowed. Let's find one first. They hurried down the hall, their footsteps echoing too loud in the stillness. The air was wrong here, too heavy, too full. The school was watching them. Jessica stopped abruptly at a half-open door. Restroom, she breathed. There's got to be a mirror in here. Mark hesitated. You sure that's a good idea? No, I'm not sure about anything, but we need to breathe for a second. No one argued. They stepped inside. The restroom was large, rows of stalls stretching out into the dark. The stench of old mildew clung to the air. Cracks ran through the tiles, and the mirror above the sinks was huge, too big, stretching across the entire wall. Mark kept his gaze low, unwilling to look at his reflection. Something about it made his skin crawl. Jessica turned on the sink. Nothing, just a sputter of dust and air. Emily hugged herself, rocking slightly. I don't like this. It's too quiet. It's like something's waiting. Ryan scoffed. Yeah, well, join the club. Then Mark noticed it. The reflection of Ryan. It moved too slow, just a fraction of a second behind, like an old video lagging behind reality. Mark's stomach dropped. Ryan, he whispered. Don't move. Ryan frowned, confused. What? Why? Then his reflection smiled. Mark's breath left his lungs in a rush. Ryan wasn't smiling, but his reflection was too wide, too many teeth. Then it moved on its own. The reflected Ryan took a slow, deliberate step forward. The real Ryan didn't move. Emily screamed. Ryan stumbled backward, his breath ragged. What the? His reflection stayed put for just a second too long, then snapped back into place. Mark clamped a hand over his mouth. Jessica jerked her head away from the mirror, eyes squeezed shut. Don't look at it! Don't look! Ryan made a strangled noise, backing away. What the hell is happening? Emily turned. Her reflection didn't. It just stood there, head tilted, staring at her. Then slowly it lifted a hand and tapped against the glass. Once, twice. Ryan grabbed her arm. We're leaving, now. They turned and bolted. Behind them, the mirror cracked. The tapping turned into pounding. Something wanted out. They didn't stop running until the pounding behind them faded into silence. Mark's legs burned, but he didn't dare slow down. The others were gasping, their breaths ragged. The school was twisting around them. Doors they had passed earlier were gone, hallways stretching longer than they should. Then the whispers stopped. All at once, the silence was worse. It pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. Ryan muttered, I hate this so much. Jessica grabbed his wrist, squeezing hard. We keep moving, A metallic clatter echoed down the hallway. Mark turned sharply. The lockers, they lined both sides of the hall, rusted and covered in peeling paint. But now they were shaking, a slow, rhythmic rattling like something was inside, slamming against the metal doors. One after another, they trembled. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. Run! They bolted. The sound followed them, lockers slamming, rattling, shrieking. And then the doors burst open. Mark caught a glimpse of something crawling out. Long, thin limbs folding over themselves, joints bending the wrong way. Too many fingers. The whispering surged back all at once, screaming in his skull. Emily let out a strangled sob. Don't look. Mark squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to see them. He could hear them, skittering, dragging across the tile, the soft scrape of 2 long nails on metal. Jessica tripped. Ryan caught her, yanking her forward as something snatched at her ankle. She kicked wildly, screaming, and Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her free. They ran, blindly, desperately. Something whispered right beside his ear. Too close, too real, but he didn't look. They slammed into a door at the end of the hallway, and Mark shoved it open, stumbling inside. A classroom. They threw themselves against the door, slamming it shut. The whispers stopped again. The silence was deafening. Mark's whole body shook. He tried to steady his breathing, but his pulse refused to slow. Then behind them, the old chalkboard, covered in dust, moved. A single word scrawled across it in jagged white streaks. Eyes shut equals safety. Mark exhaled, chest tight. Jessica whispered, It can't hurt us unless we see it. Ryan let out a weak laugh. Well, that's just great. Then slowly, the chalk began moving again. It spelled their names, one by one. Mark watched, frozen, as the chalk scratched their names onto the board. Ryan, Jessica, Emily, Mark. One by one, the letters appeared, written by an invisible hand. Emily clutched Mark's sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. It knows us. Ryan's fists clenched at his sides. No kidding. Then, beneath their names, the chalk kept writing, You are not alone. Jessica backed up against a desk, shaking her head. Nope, we need to leave, now. Ryan spun toward the door. And go where? Right back into whatever the hell those things are? Mark wiped sweat from his brow. If we keep our eyes shut, they can't touch us. We just need to... The chalk scraped faster. New words appeared, jagged and frantic. One of you looked. Silence fell. A slow, creeping dread filled Mark's stomach. He turned to his friends. Jessica shook her head violently. Not me, I swear. Emily whispered, I didn't. Ryan took a step back, eyes darting between them. Oh, come on, man, what is this, a horror movie? It's trying to mess with us. Mark wanted to believe that, but something about the words felt true. Then, the chalk dropped to the floor. A rush of cold air slammed into the room, and the whispering came back. Not distant anymore, not creeping from the hall. Inside, with them. The temperature plummeted, ice forming along the edges of the windows. The shadows in the corners stretched, twisting, reaching. Then, a voice, not a whisper, not a scream, a soft, breathy mockery. Why did you look? Emily whimpered. Jessica clapped a hand over her mouth. Mark didn't move. The air was thick, pressing against his skin. He swore he felt something watching from behind him. Then, slow as death, a new name began to appear on the chalkboard, letter by letter. Mark. His blood turned to ice. Ryan grabbed his wrist. Go now. They ran. Mark didn't look back. Not at the chalkboard. Not at the twisting shadows stretching toward them. Not at the thing that whispered his name. They barreled into the next hallway, barely stopping themselves from colliding into the walls. Ahead, double doors. Jessica gasped, pointing. The gym. There's got to be an exit there. Mark didn't hesitate. They threw open the doors and rushed inside, and froze. Because the gymnasium was full. The bleachers were packed with shadowy figures. All of them staring, all of them waiting, and above them, the scoreboard lit up, counting down from 10. 10. The numbers glowed an eerie red on the scoreboard above the gym floor. Mark's breath hitched. It was counting down. Jessica clutched his arm. What happens when it hits 0? Ryan swallowed hard. I don't want to find out. 9. The bleachers were full of them. Not people, not ghosts. Shadowy figures, featureless except for their eyes, glowing, hollow, watching. Rows and rows of them, lining the seats like silent spectators. Emily whimpered, What do we do? 8. Mark's mind raced. The creatures hadn't attacked, not yet, because they were watching. This was a game, a sick, twisted game. Jessica tugged at him, voice urgent. We need to go, now. 7. Ryan turned, scanning the gym. Where's the exit? Mark's stomach dropped. There wasn't one. No doors, no windows, no way out. Just them, watching, waiting. 6. The whispers crept back, curling around them like smoke. But these weren't just whispers. They were voices. Familiar voices. Mark's breath stuttered as he heard his mother's voice. Mark, she called, soft, gentle, loving. It's okay, just look at me. Emily let out a sob. No, 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 she was shaking, her hands pressed to her ears. Ryan's face had gone pale. It's my dad, his voice cracked. I swear to God, it's my dad. Jessica's nails dug into Mark's wrist. Her lips were trembling. It's my sister. She's been gone for years. 5. Mark squeezed his eyes shut. They're lying. They were trying to trick them. 4. The figures in the bleachers leaned forward, eager, anticipating. 3. The gym darkened. The shadows moved. Mark felt something shift around them. A presence. Something huge. Something waiting. 2. Then Mark understood. It wasn't just a game. It was a test. They had to make it to the other side. But they had to do it blind. Close your eyes, Mark whispered. Jessica turned to him, eyes wide with fear. What? Close them, now. Don't open them, no matter what you hear. 1. Ryan exhaled. Oh, screw this. He grabbed his hoodie, yanked it over his head, blindfolding himself. Jessica did the same. Mark clenched his fists. Then just as the scoreboard hit 0, the gym erupted in screams. The figures rushed them. Mark squeezed his eyes shut and walked forward. Mark walked blindly, his breath tight in his chest. Don't open your eyes. The air around them shifted, heavy and thrumming with movement. The creatures were close, their presence like a cold wind against his skin. Jessica's hand gripped his wrist tightly. Emily clung to the back of his jacket. Ryan's heavy breathing was just behind him. They were still together. That was all that mattered. The whispers grew desperate. Mark, his mother's voice right beside his ear. Sweetheart, open your eyes. I'm right here. His jaw clenched. No, not real. A warm hand brushed against his arm. A voice. Jessica's voice. Mark, it's okay. You can look. We're safe now. He almost fell for it. Almost. But Jessica was still holding his wrist. They could imitate voices. They couldn't mimic touch. Emily let out a choked cry. It's my dad! I can hear him! Ryan cursed under his breath. Just keep moving, Em. Ignore it. Their feet hit the gym floor, step by step, inch by inch. Something brushed against Mark's leg. Long fingers. Too many fingers. He didn't stop. Emily let out a sharp breath. There's a door. I feel a handle. Mark heard Ryan stumble, let out a startled gasp. Mark's heart nearly stopped. Ryan? Silence. A long, cold silence. Then a hoarse whisper. I'm here, Ryan. Mark's pulse slammed against his ribs. You okay? Yeah, let's go. Emily yanked the door open. Cold night air rushed in. They ran. Through the threshold into the darkened street. The whispers cut off. The air stilled. And suddenly the school was just a school again. Silent. Motionless. The windows empty. Jessica gasped, falling to her knees on the pavement. Emily sobbed, pressing her hands to her face. Ryan braced himself against the curb, shaking. Mark turned, his breath visible in the cold air. It was over. Then Ryan whispered, Don't. Mark frowned. What? Ryan's voice trembled. Don't look back. Mark swallowed, his whole body tensing. Jessica whispered, Why? Ryan's voice barely held together. Because they're still watching. Mark couldn't help himself. He turned and froze. The school was still. The night was quiet. But in the windows, dozens of grinning faces, watching, waiting. Then in the reflection of the car window beside them, a fifth shadow stood among them. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The reflection in the car window. 5 shadows instead of 4. A 5th figure, standing just behind them. Close enough to touch. His blood ran cold. Ryan saw it too. His face paled, lips parting slightly. Jessica's breath hitched. Emily took an unsteady step back. None of them turned around. None of them looked. Mark's pulse hammered. The school loomed behind them, its windows filled with watching faces, silent, waiting. The 5th shadow didn't move. Ryan's voice was barely a whisper. "We're not alone." Mark swallowed. "I know." The reflection in the window tilted its head. A slow, unnatural movement, like it was studying them. Jessica squeezed her eyes shut. "What do we do?" Emily was shaking. I don't know. Then the reflection smiled. Not Ryan, not Jessica, not Emily. The thing. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, and then it lifted a hand and waved. Emily screamed. Ryan grabbed her, yanking her away from the car. "Get in, now." Mark tore open the driver's door, hand shaking as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The car roared to life. Jessica threw herself into the passenger seat. Emily and Ryan tumbled into the back. Mark's foot slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeched against pavement. He didn't look at the school, didn't look at the windows filled with grinning faces, didn't look at the thing standing behind them. He drove, fast. Streetlights blurred past. The school faded into the darkness behind them. The whispers were gone. Silence filled the car, thick and suffocating. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. They didn't stop until they were miles away, pulling into an empty gas station parking lot. Only then did Mark let out a shuddering breath. His hands shook violently against the steering wheel. Jessica was hunched forward, face in her hands. Emily pressed her forehead against the window, staring blankly into the night. Ryan just sat there, staring straight ahead. Mark exhaled, voice hoarse. Did we make it?" No one answered. Then, a quiet tap. Mark stiffened. The others froze. Slowly, almost against his will, Mark turned his head. The rearview mirror reflected the 4 of them, and behind them, a 5th shadow, still smiling. When you hear stories about the dark web, they often feel distant, like something out of a bad horror movie or an urban legend passed down to scare the gullible. I used to think the same way. Sure, I'd read my share of Reddit tales about people who claimed they'd had close encounters with the worst parts of the internet, but I always thought those were just stories. Fiction. Until, of course, it happened to me. It all started innocently enough, as these things tend to. I'm not some tech genius or hacker. I'm just an ordinary guy with a bit too much curiosity and an unhealthy amount of free time. One evening, after scrolling through endless YouTube videos and Reddit threads, I stumbled upon a discussion about the dark web. It was full of the usual warnings and dramatic accounts, but one comment caught my eye. It wasn't some wild tale about hitmen or bizarre cults. It was just a casual remark about a particular forum where people supposedly shared their experiences with the darkest corners of the internet. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the browser and moved on with my life. But curiosity has a way of getting the better of us. So I found myself searching for information on how to access the dark web. It wasn't hard, just a few Google searches, and I had all the instructions I needed. Downloading the Tor browser felt like a step too far, but by then, I was too deep in to back out. I told myself I'd just look around, maybe read a few posts, and then leave. No harm done, right? The first few minutes were underwhelming. It looked like any other old-school internet forum, with clunky design and obscure threads. I skimmed through discussions about privacy, encryption, and other topics that flew way over my head. Then I saw it. The forum I'd read about. It was simply titled Revenge. At first glance, it seemed like a place for people to vent. There were posts about petty revenge on bosses, exes, and neighbors. Some were even kind of funny, in a dark, twisted way. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. The stories became darker, more sinister. People were talking about ruining lives, destroying careers, even breaking up families. It was unsettling, but I couldn't stop reading. Each post was more disturbing than the last, detailing elaborate schemes that sounded too extreme to be true. Then, I did something incredibly stupid. In hindsight, it's the kind of thing that makes you want to go back in time and slap yourself. I commented. I don't even remember what I said exactly. Something sarcastic, dismissive. I made a joke about how ridiculous these revenge fantasies were, saying it was all just talk and that no one here would actually follow through on any of it. I figured it would just get buried in the sea of comments. I didn't expect anyone to even notice, but someone did. I logged off after that, not thinking much of it. It was late, and I had work in the morning, so I shut down my computer and went to bed. The next day was normal, boring even. Work was the usual grind, and by the time I got home, I'd nearly forgotten about my little venture into the dark web. It wasn't until I checked my email later that night that I started to worry. There was a message from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was simple. You. At first, I thought it was spam and almost deleted it without opening it. But something made me pause. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The email was short, just a few sentences, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. You think this is a joke? You think we won't find you? We'll see how funny you are when you're the one running. My heart dropped. I reread the email a dozen times, trying to convince myself it was just someone messing with me. But the more I thought about it, the more it scared me. How did they get my email? I'd been so careful, or so I thought. I hadn't given out any personal information, hadn't signed up for anything. It didn't make sense. I decided to ignore it. Maybe it was just a bluff, some troll trying to scare me off. But the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, more emails came. Each one was more threatening than the last. They talked about my home, my family, even the route I took to work. It was like they were watching me, and they wanted me to know it. That's when the paranoia set in. Every time I left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I started taking different routes to work, avoiding my usual spots. I even considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I got into a pissing match with some random stranger on the dark web? It sounded ridiculous. Then, the phone calls started. At first, they were just hang-ups. My phone would ring, and when I answered, there'd be nothing but silence on the other end. But soon the calls became more frequent, more insistent. Sometimes they'd say my name, or repeat my address, or just breathe heavily into the receiver. It was driving me insane. I tried blocking the number, changing my email, even getting a new phone, but nothing worked. Whoever this was, they were determined. My nights were filled with anxiety, jumping at every creak and shadow. My family noticed the change in me. How could they not? I was jumpy, irritable, barely sleeping, but what could I tell them? The truth was too bizarre, too terrifying. I thought about leaving, packing up and disappearing for a while, but I knew it wouldn't solve anything. They'd find me. They'd already proved they could. The fear was paralyzing, and I was quickly running out of options. Then, one night, I heard something outside my window. It was late, past midnight, and the house was quiet. I just started to drift off when I heard a faint scratching sound, like something scraping against the side of the house. I froze, my heart racing. The sound was so soft, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But then it came again, louder this time, and I knew it was real. I didn't want to move, didn't want to go near the window, but I couldn't just lie there. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept over to the window, my hands trembling. I pulled back the curtain just a fraction, enough to peek outside. There was nothing there, just darkness. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself, a raccoon or a stray cat. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. I knew it was them. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in bed, staring at the window, listening to every creak and groan of the house. When the sun finally rose, I felt a strange sense of relief, like I'd made it through something dangerous, but I knew it wasn't over. Far from it. The next morning, I found a note on my car windshield. It was just a single word, scrawled in red ink. Soon. I can't describe the feeling of finding that note on my windshield. It was like someone had plunged a knife into my gut and twisted it. The fact that they had been close enough to my house, close enough to leave that note, sent my mind spiraling. I realized then that this wasn't just some online threat. This was real, and it was right at my doorstep. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at that single word. Soon. It was so vague, yet so terrifying. What did they mean by soon? What were they planning? I looked around the street, searching for anything out of place, but everything looked normal. The usual cars were parked in the driveways. The morning air was crisp and still, but that only made it worse. They had come and gone without a trace, and I had no idea how or when they'd do it again. I didn't go to work that day. I called in sick, even though I knew that hiding inside wouldn't solve anything. But I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I say? I'd sound like a lunatic, talking about the dark web and anonymous threats. And what proof did I have? A few emails, some creepy phone calls, and now this note. It wasn't enough. So instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I tried to disappear. Not literally, but I tried to make myself as invisible as possible. I stopped going out after dark, kept my blinds closed, and avoided using the internet for anything other than the essentials. I even started parking my car in the garage, hoping that would make it harder for them to get close to me again. For a few days it worked. The emails stopped, the phone calls ceased, and I began to feel like maybe they had given up. Maybe they'd moved on to someone else. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I'd seen too many stories about how these things could escalate. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then it happened. I was sitting in the living room one evening, trying to distract myself with a mindless TV show when I heard the sound of breaking glass. It came from the back of the house, the unmistakable sound of a window shattering. My heart leaped into my throat as I jumped to my feet, every nerve in my body on high alert. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? Should I go see what it was? My brain raced through all the possibilities, none of them good. But before I could make a decision, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the direction of the kitchen. Whoever it was, they were inside my house. My mind went blank with fear. I didn't have a weapon, didn't have any way to defend myself. The only thing I could think to do was hide. I bolted for the closet in the hallway, slipping inside and pulling the door shut behind me as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was in the house would hear it. The footsteps got closer, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't come this way. I could hear them moving around the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinets like they were searching for something. I didn't dare peek out, but I could imagine them, some faceless figure methodically going through my things, taking their time. After what felt like hours, the footsteps finally moved away. I heard them head towards the front of the house, and then just as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. The front door creaked open and then slammed shut, leaving the house in eerie silence. I stayed in that closet for a long time, too afraid to move. When I finally emerged, every muscle in my body was stiff and sore. I crept through the house, checking every room, every window, but whoever it was, they were gone. In the kitchen, I found the broken window and a mess of drawers pulled open, utensils scattered everywhere, but nothing seemed to be missing. That's when I noticed the second note. It was sitting on the kitchen counter right next to the sink. Unlike the first note, this one was longer, and the message was clear. You can't hide. We will find you. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just about scaring me anymore. This was personal. They wanted me to know that no matter what I did, they would always be one step ahead. I was trapped in a game I didn't know how to win. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would do any good if they came back. I didn't know what else to do. My mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. How long could I keep this up? How long before they did something worse? And what would happen to my family if they got caught in the crossfire? The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside sent my heart racing. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next move. The next morning, I called my family. I didn't tell them everything. How could I? But I told them enough. I said that I'd gotten mixed up in something bad, that someone was after me, and that I didn't know how serious it might get. My parents were worried, of course, but they didn't really understand. They kept telling me to go to the police, to let them handle it, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Whoever this was, they were smart, resourceful. I didn't think the police would be able to protect me, not completely. But then my sister said something that gave me an idea. She asked if I had any friends who were good with computers, someone who might be able to help track these people down. I hadn't thought about it before, but I did have a friend, a guy I'd known since college who worked in cybersecurity. If anyone could help me figure out who was behind this, it was him. I called him up that afternoon, and thankfully he agreed to meet with me. I didn't tell him everything over the phone, just that I needed his help with something serious. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop the next day, somewhere public, where I felt safe. As I waited for the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every car that passed by my house, every person who walked down the street felt like a potential threat. I knew it was probably just my paranoia, but it didn't make the fear any less real. When I finally met up with my friend, I told him everything. How I'd stumbled onto that forum, how I'd made a stupid comment, and how it had all spiraled out of control. He listened carefully, not interrupting, and when I was done, he looked more serious than I'd ever seen him. "This is bad," he said, not sugarcoating it. "These people, whoever they are, they're not messing around. You're right to be scared." "But what can I do?" I asked, desperate for some kind of solution. He thought for a moment, then leaned in closer. "We need to find out who they are. If we can trace their IP, maybe we can figure out where they're operating from. It's risky, but it might be our only shot at stopping them before things get worse." The plan made sense, but it also terrified me. If we poked the bear, would they come after me even harder? But what choice did I have? I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack. So we made a plan. My friend would set up some traps, ways to lure them into revealing their location. It would take time and a lot of patience, but if it worked, we might finally get the upper hand. As I left the coffee shop, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Maybe there was a way out of this after all. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by the fear that if this didn't work, I'd be in more danger than ever. When I left the coffee shop, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. My friend's plan was risky, but it was the only chance I had to take control of this nightmare. The days of waiting for something terrible to happen were over. Now it was time to fight back. My friend, who I'll call Mike, got to work right away. He was meticulous, setting up a series of digital traps designed to lure the people harassing me into revealing their location. He explained it all to me in terms that I could barely understand. Something about phishing, spoofed emails, and traceable links. It all sounded like something out of a spy movie, and I had to admit it was a bit over my head. But I trusted Mike. If anyone could pull this off, it was him. We set up in my house, turning my living room into a makeshift command center. Mike brought over his laptop, along with a bunch of other gadgets that I couldn't even name. He was in his element, focused and calm, while I was a nervous wreck. Every time the door creaked or the floorboards groaned, I jumped, half expecting someone to come bursting in. Mike assured me that it would take time. "These guys are smart," he said, typing away on his keyboard. "They're not going to fall for the first trap. We have to be patient." Patience was not something I was good at. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whoever was behind this was just waiting for us to slip up. I tried to distract myself with TV, books, anything to keep my mind off the situation, but nothing worked. My thoughts kept circling back to the possibility that this could end very, very badly. Then, after what felt like days but was really only a few hours, Mike suddenly stiffened. "I think we've got something," he said, his eyes glued to the screen. I rushed over, peering over his shoulder, but all I saw was a bunch of code and numbers that meant nothing to me. Mike, on the other hand, looked like he'd just struck gold. "They took the bait," he said, grinning for the first time since we'd started this. "I sent them a link disguised as an update to their forum software. They clicked it and now we're in." "In where?" I asked, still trying to wrap my head around it. "Their system, or at least part of it. We've got their IP address, which means we can start tracing them back to their physical location." I didn't want to get my hopes up too much, but this sounded like the breakthrough we needed. If we could figure out where these people were, maybe we could turn the tables on them. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally get my life back. Mike spent the next few hours analyzing the data, his face a mask of concentration. I watched him work, feeling more useless than ever. He was doing all the heavy lifting, and all I could do was sit there, waiting for him to figure out our next move. Finally, he looked up at me, his expression serious. "I've got a lead," he said. "It's not much, but it's a start. The IP address traces back to a small town in upstate New York. It's probably not their actual location. They're likely using a proxy. But it's something we can work with." "A small town?" I repeated, trying to make sense of it. "Why there? It's remote, off the grid, the perfect place to operate if you don't want to be found. But if they've made even a single mistake, we might be able to track them down." I nodded, feeling a mix of hope and dread. This was it, the moment we'd been waiting for. But the closer we got to finding these people, the more dangerous it felt. If they realized we were onto them, who knew what they'd do next? Mike must have sensed my fear because he put a hand on my shoulder and gave me a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to be careful," he said. "I'll handle the tech side of things, but we'll need to involve the authorities soon. This is getting too big for just the two of us." The mention of the authorities made my stomach turn. I'd been avoiding that route, afraid of how it would complicate things, but I knew he was right. This had escalated far beyond what I could handle on my own. Reluctantly, I agreed. We spent the next few hours gathering all the evidence we had. Emails, the note, the broken window, and now this new digital trail. By the time we were ready to contact the police, it was well past midnight, but neither of us was in any condition to sleep. We made the call early the next morning. I was jittery, pacing the floor as Mike explained the situation to the detective. I half expected them to dismiss us, to say it was all just a bad prank, but to my surprise, they took it seriously. They promised to look into the lead and assigned an officer to watch my house for the next few nights, just in case. For the first time in days, I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe now, with the police involved, I could finally start to feel safe again. But that feeling didn't last long. Later that night, just as I was beginning to think things might be turning around, I got another email. This one was different from the others. It wasn't threatening, exactly, but it was unsettling in a way I hadn't expected. It was a photo, a picture of me and Mike sitting in the coffee shop from the day before. The timestamp showed it had been taken just a few minutes after we'd met. The message below it was chillingly simple. "Nice try." My blood ran cold. They had known all along. They'd been watching us, probably from the moment I'd first opened that cursed forum. They were one step ahead, and now they knew we were trying to track them down. I showed the email to Mike, and the look on his face said it all. We were in deeper than we'd realized, and the stakes were higher than ever. The game had just changed, and not in our favor. "Okay," Mike said, his voice steady but strained. "We're going to need to be even more careful. We've rattled their cage, and now they're going to come after you even harder. But that means they might get sloppy. And if they do, we'll be ready." I nodded, trying to muster some of his confidence. But inside, I was terrified. The walls were closing in, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. This had started as a stupid mistake, a moment of reckless curiosity. But now it was spiraling into something far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't back down now, not when my life, and the lives of the people I cared about, were on the line. The moment I saw that photo, everything changed. Any hope I had that this would blow over evaporated. Whoever was after me wasn't just some faceless hacker. They were real, they were close, and they were playing a game I wasn't equipped to win. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them ended well. This was no longer just a digital threat. It was something far more terrifying. Mike was already on his laptop, typing furiously, but I could see the worry etched on his face. We had pushed them, and they had pushed back. Hard. The realization that they had been watching us in the coffee shop, so casually and without us even noticing, made my skin crawl. We were dealing with professionals, people who knew exactly how to stay one step ahead. The police took the new email seriously, which was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. They doubled their patrols around my neighborhood, and I noticed the officers driving by my house more frequently. They even set up a temporary camera across the street to monitor any suspicious activity. But as comforting as all this was supposed to be, it only made the reality of the situation sink in deeper. This was real, and the stakes were higher than ever. Mike and I spent the next few days working with the police, trying to piece together whatever clues we could find. Every little detail mattered now. We combed through the emails, the broken window and the photo, looking for anything that might give us an edge. Mike was relentless, refusing to let up even when it seemed like we were hitting dead ends. But the more we dug, the more I realized how vulnerable I really was. The police were doing what they could, but I knew that if these people really wanted to get to me, they would find a way. The stress was getting to me. I was barely eating, barely sleeping, constantly on edge. Every shadow outside my window, every unfamiliar sound, sent me into a panic. My life had become a waking nightmare, and there was no end in sight. Then, one night, things took a turn I hadn't expected. It was around midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too anxious to sleep. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only seems to exist in the dead of night. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise coming from downstairs, a soft thud, followed by the creak of floorboards. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, or if someone was actually in the house. I strained to listen, barely breathing, but the noise didn't come again. For a moment I considered waking Mike, who was sleeping in the guest room, but something told me to stay quiet. Slowly, I slipped out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. I waited, listening, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, moving in the darkness near the front door. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Someone was in the house, and they were standing just a few feet away from me. I froze, too terrified to move, but the figure didn't seem to notice me. They were focused on something else, something they were holding in their hand. I couldn't see what it was, but the sight of it made my blood run cold. It was small, metallic, and glinted in the dim light. Before I could even think about what to do, the figure moved towards the front door, slipping outside without making a sound. The door closed softly behind them, and then they were gone, swallowed by the night. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Who was that? What were they doing in my house? And why hadn't they done anything? It didn't make sense. If they were here to hurt me, why had they left so quietly? It was like they wanted me to know they'd been there, to let me know just how easy it was for them to get to me whenever they wanted. Shaking, I went downstairs to check the front door. It was locked, just as I'd left it. I looked around, trying to find any sign of what the intruder had been doing, but everything seemed untouched. The only clue was a small object left on the floor near the door, a USB drive. I picked it up with trembling hands, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to destroy it, to get rid of anything that might make things worse, but I knew that wasn't the answer. I needed to know what was on it. Maybe it would give us a clue about who these people were, or what they wanted. I woke Mike, and we plugged the USB drive into his laptop. We both held our breath as the screen flickered to life, revealing a single file. It was a video, titled simply, "Watch." Mike hesitated, his finger hovering over the play button. "Are you sure you want to see this?" he asked, glancing at me. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure at all. But we had come this far. I couldn't back out now. The video started, and what we saw made my stomach turn. It was a compilation of footage, all taken from various cameras around my house, cameras that I didn't know existed. They had been watching me for weeks, maybe even longer. The video showed me going about my daily life, completely oblivious to the fact that I was being monitored. There were shots of me in the kitchen, in the living room, even in my bedroom. But the worst part was the end of the video. It showed the intruder from earlier that night, standing in my living room, looking directly at the camera. They didn't say anything, didn't make any threatening gestures. They just stood there, staring, before finally walking out of the frame. The video ended, and Mike and I just sat there, too stunned to speak. They had been inside my house watching me, and I hadn't even known it. The message was clear. They were in control, and they wanted me to know it. Mike was the first to break the silence. "We need to show this to the police," he said, his voice steady but tense. "This is evidence. They can trace the cameras, figure out where the footage was being sent." I nodded, barely able to process what I'd just seen. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. Why were they doing this? What did they want? And more importantly, how much further were they willing to go? The next day, we handed the USB drive over to the police. They took it seriously, escalating the investigation and promising to do everything they could to protect me. But I could tell that even they were unnerved by the video. This wasn't just a case of harassment, it was something far more sinister. As the days passed, the police increased their presence around my house. There were officers stationed outside at all hours, and they even brought in a team to sweep the house for any hidden cameras. They found several, all expertly concealed, and removed them. But the damage was already done. The knowledge that I'd been watched so closely, so intimately, was something I couldn't shake. I tried to go about my life as normally as possible, but it was impossible. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every car that drove by, every stranger who looked my way felt like a potential threat. The fear was consuming me, making it hard to think, to function. Mike stayed with me, doing his best to keep me grounded, but even he couldn't hide his concern. We were both living on edge, waiting for the next move, knowing that it could come at any moment. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the phone rang. It was the detective assigned to my case, his voice urgent. "We've got them," he said. "We traced the cameras back to a location in upstate New York. It's a small group. Looks like they've been running these kinds of operations for a while. We're moving in to arrest them now." Relief flooded through me, so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed. They were caught. It was over. I didn't know what to say, how to express the gratitude and the exhaustion that came with the news. But the detective wasn't done. "There's something you need to know," he continued, his tone more serious. "They weren't just watching you. They were planning something. We found documents, blueprints, a timeline. They were planning to take this further, much further." My heart sank. I didn't need to ask what he meant. I knew. The intruder, the video, the escalating threats. They hadn't just been playing with me. They had been preparing for something far worse, and if the police hadn't caught them, I might not have been here to tell this story. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, fear, anger, and a deep, bone-chilling realization of how close I had come to losing everything. The people who had terrorized me were behind bars, but the scars they left behind would take a long time to heal. My life had been turned upside down by a single, careless mistake, and it was only by sheer luck and the help of a good friend that I had made it through. But this was far from over. There were still questions to be answered, and a long road to recovery ahead. When the news broke that the people who had been stalking me were finally arrested, I expected to feel nothing but relief. And I did, for a while. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that the end of this nightmare wasn't as clean-cut as I'd hoped. The fear didn't just vanish overnight. It lingered like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. The police had done their job well. They tracked down the group in upstate New York, a small, isolated cabin where they'd been operating their twisted scheme. The details were chilling. They weren't just some random internet trolls. They were part of a larger network that targeted people like me, curious, unsuspecting individuals who wandered into the wrong corner of the dark web. They would isolate their victims, torment them, and eventually, well, no one knew exactly what their endgame was, but it was clear that I had been their next target. The media caught wind of the story, and for a brief period my life was thrown into another kind of chaos. Reporters wanted interviews, my name was in the papers, and people I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out, all wanting to know how I was holding up. I didn't want any of it. I just wanted to move on, to forget that any of this had ever happened. Mike was a constant presence through all of it, and I can't express how grateful I was to have him around. He was the one who dealt with the reporters, who spoke to the police when I couldn't find the words. He even stayed with me for a while after the arrests, just to make sure I wasn't alone. His support was the only thing keeping me sane. But even with Mike's help, I couldn't escape the memories. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The emails, the phone calls, the intruder in my house. It all felt like a bad dream, but the reality was much worse. My home, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I couldn't walk through my own front door without feeling like someone was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The police assured me that the threat was gone, that the people responsible were behind bars, but the damage was done. I was jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. I knew it wasn't rational, but fear doesn't listen to reason. Every time I stepped outside, I half expected to see one of them standing there watching me with that cold, calculating stare I'd seen in the video. It wasn't just me who was affected either. My family, who had been worried sick throughout the entire ordeal, was shaken too. My parents insisted that I move back in with them for a while, and though I resisted at first, I eventually agreed. The thought of living alone was unbearable, and I knew I needed the support. Living with my parents brought a sense of safety that I hadn't felt in months. Their house was familiar, comforting, and for the first time in a long time, I began to feel like maybe, just maybe, I could start to heal. The constant presence of family helped ease the anxiety, and slowly I started to sleep through the night again. But recovery wasn't linear. There were good days and bad days. Some mornings I'd wake up and feel like I was finally moving past it, only to be blindsided by a wave of panic later that day. It was frustrating, but I had to remind myself that healing takes time. This was something I couldn't rush, no matter how much I wanted to. Mike and I stayed in close contact. He checked in on me regularly, making sure I was okay, and we even started hanging out again, trying to bring some normalcy back into my life. We talked about everything except what had happened, an unspoken agreement to leave the past where it belonged. But I could tell he was still worried about me, and to be honest, I was worried about myself too. The turning point came a few months later, when I decided to see a therapist. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd always thought I could handle things on my own, but I knew I needed help to process everything. Talking about it was hard, but it was also liberating. I realized that I had been holding on to so much fear, anger, and guilt, and it was only by confronting those feelings that I could begin to let them go. Therapy helped me understand that what had happened wasn't my fault. I hadn't asked for this, and I certainly hadn't deserved it. The people who had targeted me were criminals, plain and simple, and they were the ones to blame. Slowly, I started to reclaim my sense of self, to rebuild the confidence that had been shattered. As the months went by, the fear began to recede. I still had moments of anxiety, but they were fewer and farther between. I started going out more, seeing friends, and even got back into some of the hobbies I'd abandoned during the ordeal. Life wasn't exactly the same as it had been before, but it was getting closer. One day I got a call from the detective who had handled my case. He wanted to let me know that the trial was over, and the people responsible had been sentenced to a long time in prison. Hearing those words brought a sense of closure that I didn't realize I needed. It was finally over. Looking back now, I can see how much I've changed. What happened to me was terrifying, and it left scars that will probably never fully heal. But I've also grown stronger because of it. I've learned to be more cautious, to value the people in my life who stood by me when things were at their worst, and most importantly, to never let fear control me. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this: be careful. The internet, and especially the dark web, is full of dangers that most of us can't even begin to imagine. A single careless mistake can spiral into something far worse than you ever thought possible. But if you find yourself in a situation like mine, know that you don't have to face it alone. There are people out there who can help, and with the right support, you can make it through. I'm still working on moving forward, but for the first time in a long time, I can see a future where this nightmare is just a memory. It's not easy, but it's possible, and that's something worth holding on to. I'm not one to get involved in other people's business, especially when it comes to stuff that's even remotely shady. But there's something about my daily routine that makes me observant, maybe even a little too much for my own good. Every morning, without fail, I stop by this cozy little coffee shop on my way to work. It's one of those places that somehow hasn't been taken over by the usual coffee chains, and it's got this warm, familiar vibe that makes it easy to feel at home. The baristas there know my order by heart: medium black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Simple and straight to the point, just like my approach to life. There's this one barista though, let's call him Joe. He's always been kind of a mystery to me. Quiet, a bit reserved, but always polite. He's the type of guy who keeps to himself, does his job, and doesn't engage much beyond the usual small talk. Nothing unusual, right? But about a week ago, something happened that's been gnawing at me ever since. I was sitting in my usual corner, scrolling through news headlines on my phone, when a guy walked up to the counter to place his order. I didn't pay much attention until he called Joe by a nickname. The name was Ghost. It was weird because I'd never heard anyone call Joe that before, but what really set off alarm bells was that I'd seen that nickname before. I was sure of it. Ghost was a name I'd come across in a dark web chat room I'd stumbled onto a few months back. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just doing some late-night browsing out of curiosity. The conversation in that chat room was unsettling, full of conspiracy theories, strange codes, and people who clearly had something to hide. Hearing that name again in such a mundane setting gave me a sense of déjà vu, but not the pleasant kind. My mind started racing. Could Joe be the same Ghost from that chat room? It seemed unlikely. What are the odds, right? But the idea stuck with me. Maybe it was the way the guy said it, like he knew Joe from somewhere deeper than just a coffee shop. Joe didn't react much, just gave a slight nod and went on with his work. but I noticed his hands were shaking when he handed over the coffee. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, I found myself diving back into the dark web, searching for any trace of that chat room, that nickname. But it was like it had disappeared without a trace. The next morning, I went back to the coffee shop, trying to act normal, but inside I was restless. I watched Joe more closely, noticed little things I hadn't before. How he kept looking over his shoulder, how he tensed up when a customer lingered too long. It was like he was waiting for something, or someone. After work, I decided to approach him, to see if there was something more to this. Maybe it was a bad idea. Actually, it was definitely a bad idea. But curiosity got the better of me. The shop was nearly empty when I walked in. Just Joe behind the counter, cleaning up for the night. "Hey, Joe," I started, trying to sound casual. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up, his eyes wary, but he nodded. "Sure, what's up?" "I heard someone call you Ghost yesterday," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's probably nothing, but is that a nickname or something?" For a split second, something dark flashed across his face. Then, faster than I could react, he reached under the counter and pulled out a knife. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't what I expected. "You don't know what you're talking about," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "Stay out of it." I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. But I wasn't about to let myself be a victim. On pure instinct, I kicked out, knocking the knife from his hand. It clattered to the floor, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, as if realizing what just happened, Joe's eyes widened in panic. He backed away, raising his hands. "You people are never going to catch me," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and anger. And then, just like that, he turned and bolted out of the shop, disappearing into the night. I stood there stunned, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Who the hell was Joe? And what had I just stumbled into? I looked down at the knife on the floor, my thoughts swirling in 1,000 different directions. The next few days I kept going to the coffee shop, half expecting to see Joe again, but he never showed up. The other baristas didn't seem to know where he'd gone, just that he hadn't come to work and nobody could reach him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Part of me wanted to let it go, to just forget the whole thing and move on. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much bigger going on, something dangerous. I wasn't about to get involved. I wasn't that stupid. But I couldn't help feeling like I was already too deep in, so now I'm just observing from a distance, trying to piece together the fragments of what little I know. I don't know who Joe really is or why he's on the run, but I'm certain of one thing. Whatever it is, it's not something I want to be a part of. But somehow I can't stop watching. After that night, things didn't feel the same. I kept going to the coffee shop every morning like clockwork, but there was a different kind of tension hanging in the air. The other baristas were still there, as friendly and upbeat as always. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something they weren't saying. Joe's sudden disappearance wasn't just a random thing. I could sense that much. I didn't mention what happened to anyone. What could I say? That the quiet barista I saw every morning pulled a knife on me because I called him by a nickname I saw on the dark web? No one would believe me, and even if they did, it would only raise more questions I didn't have answers to. So I kept my mouth shut and tried to act normal, but the more I tried to move on, the more things started to feel off. It wasn't just Joe's absence that was weird. It was the way the coffee shop seemed to change without him. The vibe was different, subtle but there. The baristas were still smiling, still chatting with customers. But there was a sort of edge to them now, like they were all waiting for something to happen. One morning, about 3 days after Joe vanished, I noticed something strange. I was sitting in my usual spot, sipping my coffee and trying to push thoughts of Joe out of my head, when I saw a man I'd never seen before walk in. He wasn't like the regulars who usually came in. He He was older, maybe in his mid-40s, with a serious look on his face, dressed in a plain black suit that looked out of place in our little coffee shop. He didn't order anything. Instead, he walked straight to the counter, leaned in close to the barista, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 22, and started talking to him in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the way the barista's face paled as the man spoke. Whatever it wasn't good news. The man handed the barista something, an envelope, I think, before turning on his heel and walking out as quickly as he'd come in. The barista stood there, staring at the envelope in his hands like it was about to explode. He glanced around the shop, his eyes darting nervously from one customer to another, and then he quickly stuffed the envelope under the counter and went back to work, trying to act like nothing had happened. But I saw it all, and I knew right then that Joe's disappearance wasn't just some random event. There was something bigger going on, something I was only just beginning to glimpse. That dark web nickname, the knife, the man in the suit, it all connected somehow, but I was still in the dark about the details. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. What had Joe gotten himself into? And more importantly, how much danger was I in now? I'd already gotten too close for comfort by confronting him, and now I was seeing things I probably shouldn't have. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to find out more. Not because I wanted to be a hero or anything, but because the not knowing was driving me crazy. I wasn't planning on getting involved. I just needed some answers, enough to put my mind at ease so I could move on with my life. So I started paying closer attention, not just at the coffee shop, but everywhere. I watched the customers, the baristas, even the people on the street outside. I looked for anything out of place, any sign that something was brewing beneath the surface. And it didn't take long to notice that things were happening, small, subtle things that most people wouldn't pick up on. For one, the coffee shop started getting visits from people who didn't seem like they belonged there. A group of men in their late 30s, all wearing similar dark clothing, came in one morning and sat at a table near the back. They didn't order much, just a couple of drinks, but they stayed for a long time, talking quietly among themselves. When they left, they didn't leave any trash behind, not even a napkin, like they hadn't been there at all. Then there were the two women who showed up in the afternoon, about a week after Joe's disappearance. They were dressed casually, but there was something off about them, something too precise in the way they moved, the way they scanned the room with quick, sharp glances. They stayed only a few minutes before leaving, but I could feel their eyes on me as they walked out, as if they knew I was watching them. And the baristas, every single one of them, started acting more on edge. The usual banter and friendliness was still there, but it felt forced, like they were trying too hard to keep up appearances. They didn't smile as much, and there were moments when I'd catch them exchanging worried glances, like they were all in on some secret they couldn't talk about. One day I decided to take a different route to work, just to clear my head. I walked past the coffee shop and noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There, across the street, was a black van, parked in a spot that had been empty just the day before. It was one of those unmarked vans you see in movies, the kind that screams surveillance without needing a sign. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. I stood there for a moment, watching the van, trying to decide if I was being paranoid or if I was actually onto something. Then, as if to confirm my suspicions, the van's engine started and it pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the morning traffic. By the time I got to work, I was more confused and anxious than ever. What the hell was going on? I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if there was really something sinister happening right under my nose. All I knew was that I needed to keep my distance, but at the same time, I couldn't just let it go. Over the next few days, I kept up my routine, watching and waiting for something, anything that might give me more clues. But Joe didn't come back, and the strange visitors stopped showing up at the coffee shop. The baristas seemed to relax a little, but that underlying tension was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. And then, just when I thought things might finally settle down, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. It was a small thing, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But there, on the side of the coffee shop's door, was a small symbol, etched into the wood so faintly you could only see it up close. It was a triangle with a line running through it, and beneath it a series of numbers. I didn't recognize the symbol, but I knew it wasn't something the shop's owners would have put there. It was like a mark, something deliberate, something meant to be seen by those who knew what it meant. I don't know what the symbol stood for, but I knew enough to understand that it wasn't good. It was a warning, a message, or maybe even a threat. And the fact that it was there, on the door of the place I visited every day, made me realize just how close I'd come to something dangerous. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had a choice to make. Either walk away and pretend I never saw any of this, or keep digging until I found the truth. But I knew deep down that walking away wouldn't be enough. I was already involved, whether I liked it or not, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it would haunt me. So I decided to keep observing, keep gathering pieces of the puzzle, even if it meant risking more than just my peace of mind. Because whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The symbol on the coffee shop door stuck with me, like a thorn in my side that I couldn't ignore. Every day I passed by it, sometimes brushing my fingers against the rough etching just to remind myself it was real. I started noticing more of those symbols, on street signs, under park benches, even on the side of a lamppost near my apartment. They were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, like some kind of code scattered across the city. By this point, I was more than just curious. I was obsessed. I needed to know what the symbols meant, who was behind them, and most importantly, what connection they had to Joe and the dark web. My mornings at the coffee shop turned into covert stakeouts. I watched the door, the street outside, the customers coming in and out, looking for anything out of the ordinary. But nothing happened. No more strange men in suits, no black vans, no cryptic conversations. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was a piece of the puzzle right in front of me that I wasn't seeing. So I decided to take a different approach. I started researching the symbol, spending hours online, digging through obscure forums, old conspiracy theories, and any scrap of information I could find. It wasn't easy. Most of what I found was useless, wild speculation with no real evidence to back it up. But every once in a while I'd come across a thread that made me pause. One night, after hours of fruitless searching, I found a post on a hidden forum that caught my attention. The thread was titled, "The Watcher's Mark, a Warning or a Threat." The post itself was short, just a few sentences, but it mentioned the exact symbol I'd seen, describing it as a mark used by a group known as the Watchers. According to the post, the Watchers were a shadowy organization that monitored people, places, and events they deemed of interest. No one knew who they really were or what their ultimate goal was, but there were stories. Stories of people who crossed their path and ended up disappearing, or worse. Most of the replies dismissed the post as nonsense, calling it another baseless conspiracy theory. But one reply stood out. It was from a user with the handle Shadowbinder, and it simply said, "If you've seen the mark, it's already too late. They know you're watching." That line sent a chill through me, but not in the way those cliches and horror stories do. It was more like a cold realization settling in my bones. Was it possible that by noticing the symbols, by digging deeper, I'd somehow put myself on their radar? And if so, what did that mean for me? I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but I couldn't let it go. The next day, I decided to take a different route to work again, one that would take me through an area of the city I didn't usually visit. I was hoping to clear my head, to get some distance from the coffee shop and everything else. But as I walked, I started noticing the symbols again, more of them this time, etched into brick walls, carved into wooden fences, even spray painted onto the side of an old abandoned building. It was like they were following me, leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but I kept walking, driven by a need to understand, to see where this all led. Eventually, I found myself in a part of town that felt different, almost deserted. The buildings were old, some of them boarded up with broken windows and faded signs. It was the kind of place that seemed forgotten, left behind by the rest of the city. I turned a corner and saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, on the side of a rundown building, was the symbol again, but this time it was bigger, more detailed. The triangle was surrounded by intricate patterns, lines, and shapes that looked almost like a map or a diagram, and beneath it, scrawled in small jagged letters, were the words, "They are always watching." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the symbol, trying to make sense of it all. My mind was racing with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Was this some kind of message? A warning? Or was it something else entirely? Something I couldn't even begin to understand? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't walk away now. I had to find out the truth, no matter where it led me. So I took out my phone and snapped a picture of the symbol, hoping it might help me figure out the next step. As I stood there, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being drawn closer to something hidden just out of sight. Without really thinking about it, I reached out and traced my fingers along the lines of the symbol, feeling the rough texture of the wall beneath my skin. For a moment, everything around me seemed to fade away. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, even the light of the sun, it all dimmed, leaving me in a kind of eerie stillness. And then, just as quickly, it was over. The noise and light came rushing back, and I realized I was standing there with my hand pressed against the wall, like some kind of fool. Embarrassed, I pulled my hand away and quickly walked back the way I'd come, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. By the time I got back to the coffee shop, I was feeling more confused than ever. I ordered my usual coffee, hoping the familiar routine would help calm my nerves, but the barista, one of the regulars, gave me a strange look when he handed me my cup. It wasn't much, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, a moment of hesitation, but it was enough to make me wonder if he knew something. I took my coffee and sat down, trying to gather my thoughts. My mind was buzzing with questions, theories, and a growing sense of unease. Who were the Watchers? What did the symbol mean? And why was I seeing it everywhere now, like it was following me? As I sat there sipping my coffee, I couldn't help but feel like I was on the edge of something big, something that went far beyond a simple barista with a dark secret. But I also knew that whatever I was about to uncover, it wasn't going to be easy or safe. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed help, someone who might know more than I did. But who could I trust? The baristas? The people online? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't do this alone. So I made a decision. I would reach out to someone, anyone who might have answers. I'd keep digging, keep searching, until I found the truth. And I knew, deep down, that once I started down this path, there was no turning back. The decision to reach out for help was easier said than done. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible, but every time I caught sight of one of those symbols, or thought about Joe, the tension inside me tightened like a noose. I needed to find someone who could give me answers, but I had no idea where to start. I went back to that hidden forum, scrolling through old threads and new ones alike, searching for anything that might lead me in the right direction. Most of it was the same old conspiracy theories, but there were a few users who seemed to know more than they were letting on. People like Shadowbinder, who'd warned me about the Watchers. I figured that was as good a place to start as any, so I sent a message, keeping it vague but letting them know I'd seen the mark. Days passed with no response, and I started to lose hope. Maybe I was just chasing shadows, grasping at straws. But then, out of nowhere, I got a reply. The message was short, almost cryptic. "You're in deep now. Meet me where the city fades. Midnight. Alone." There was no username, no signature, just that one line. It didn't give me much to go on, but I had a feeling it was from Shadowbinder. The phrase, "where the city fades," stuck with me, and after thinking it over, I realized it had to be referring to the edge of the city. the place where the urban sprawl gave way to old, abandoned buildings and overgrown lots. It wasn't a part of town I visited often, and certainly not at midnight, but if there was a chance I could get some answers, I had to take it. So I waited, counting down the hours until midnight, my nerves getting worse with every passing minute. By the time I left my apartment, my heart was pounding, but I tried to keep a cool head. The streets were empty as I made my way to the outskirts of the city, the quiet night air pressing in around me. I kept my hands in my pockets, clutching my phone for some sense of security, even though I knew it wouldn't do me much good if things went south. The area was as I remembered it, run down, forgotten by the city, with weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement and buildings that looked like they hadn't seen life in years. I reached the spot I thought might be the meeting place, a small overgrown park that hadn't been used in decades. The swings were rusty, the slide half collapsed, and the benches covered in graffiti. The place gave off an eerie vibe, and I couldn't help but feel like I was walking into some kind of trap. But I pushed that thought aside, reminding myself that this was the only lead I had. I stood there for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only a few minutes. My breath fogged up in the cool night air as I scanned the shadows, waiting for any sign of movement. And then I saw them. A figure stepping out from behind one of the old trees, moving slowly, deliberately. The person was dressed in dark clothing, a hood pulled up over their head, making it hard to see their face. But I could tell from the way they moved that they weren't here to harm me, at least not right away. They approached me cautiously, stopping a few feet away, and for a moment, we just stood there in silence. Finally, the figure spoke, their voice low and gravelly, almost as if they were deliberately disguising it. "You've seen the mark. You're asking questions you shouldn't be." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "I just want to know what's going on. Who are the Watchers? And what happened to Joe?" The figure hesitated, then reached into their pocket, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. They handed it to me, their gloved hand brushing mine for the briefest moment. "This will give you some of the answers you're looking for, but be careful. The more you know, the more danger you're in." I unfolded the paper, squinting to read the handwritten notes in the dim light. It wasn't much, just a few sentences about the Watchers, describing them as a secretive group with ties to powerful people. The note mentioned that they kept tabs on individuals who posed a threat to their operations, whatever those might be. It also hinted that Joe had gotten involved with them somehow, that he might have known too much. "What does this mean?" I asked, looking up from the note, but the figure was already backing away, retreating into the shadows. "You'll figure it out," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "Just don't let them catch you digging too deep." And with that, they were gone, disappearing into the night as silently as they'd appeared. I stood there, clutching the note, my mind spinning with questions. I had some answers now, but they only led to more questions. What had Joe stumbled onto that made him a target? And why did the Watchers care about me? I wasn't a threat to anyone. I was just an ordinary guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe that was exactly the problem. Maybe I wasn't so ordinary after all, not anymore. Whatever I'd uncovered, it was enough to put me on someone's radar, and that thought terrified me. On my way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the usual paranoia, it was something deeper, a sense that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The city streets seemed darker, the shadows longer, and every sound made me jump. I got home without incident, but the tension didn't leave me. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it, then sat down at my kitchen table, staring at the note. What was I supposed to do with this? Go to the police? They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, it might only make things worse. I decided to keep the note hidden, tucked away in a place where no one would think to look. Then I sat down at my computer, determined to find out more. I wasn't sure how much time I had before the Watchers caught on to what I was doing. but I knew I had to move fast. As I delved deeper into my research, the pieces slowly began to fall into place. The Watchers weren't just a random group. They were organized, methodical, and had eyes everywhere. They used the dark web to communicate, to track people, to manipulate events in ways most of us would never even notice. And Joe had somehow gotten in their way. I knew now that whatever I was dealing with was far beyond anything I'd ever imagined. The symbols, the marks, the strange encounters, they were all part of a larger game, one I didn't fully understand but was now a part of. And as I sat there piecing together what little I knew, I realized that I was in way over my head. But it was too late to back out now. The only thing I could do was keep pushing forward, hoping I'd find a way out before it was too late. Because one thing was clear: the Watchers were real, and they were dangerous. And now, they were watching me. The days that followed were a blur of tension and sleepless nights. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something vast and terrifying, something I wasn't equipped to handle. The Watchers had been a shadowy presence in the background of my life for weeks, but now they felt closer than ever, like they were just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept to my usual routine: work, coffee shop, home, but everything felt different. The world had taken on a darker hue, and I could no longer ignore the undercurrents swirling beneath the surface of my ordinary life. The baristas at the coffee shop still smiled at me, but their eyes seemed hollow, their cheerfulness a mask that barely covered the unease beneath. I'd stopped searching for more information online. The note from the mysterious figure had been enough to convince me that the deeper I dug, the more danger I was in. But I couldn't just let it go either. Every time I thought about Joe and the symbols, about the Watchers and their cryptic messages, I felt a pull, a compulsion to understand the truth. One evening, as I was locking up at work, I received a text message from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat as I read the words on the screen. "It's time. Meet me at the place where you first saw the mark. Midnight. Don't be late." The message was short and to the point, and it left no room for interpretation. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for and dreading all at once. I had no idea who had sent the message, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. If I did, I'd be left with more questions than answers, and the uncertainty would drive me mad. So once again, I found myself heading to the edge of the city, to that forgotten park where I'd first seen the large, intricate symbol. The streets were deserted, the night air heavy with anticipation. My mind raced with possibilities. Who would meet me there? What would they tell me? And most importantly, was this a trap? The park looked the same as before, abandoned and eerie in the moonlight. I checked my watch. 11:55 p.m. I was early, but I didn't mind waiting. The tension was building inside me, a coil winding tighter with every passing second. At exactly midnight, I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see the same figure from before, dressed in dark clothing, their hood pulled up to obscure their face. They moved with the same deliberate caution, stopping a few feet away from me. "You came," they said, their voice low and rough, just like before. "I didn't have much choice," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to know what's going on." The figure nodded, then reached into their pocket and pulled out another piece of paper, this one larger and more worn than the last. They handed it to me, and I unfolded it carefully. It was a map, hand-drawn, showing the city and the surrounding area, with several locations marked in red. One of those marks was the park where we stood, but the others were places I didn't recognize. "This is the truth you've been looking for," the figure said. "The Watchers aren't just observing, they're controlling. They manipulate events, people, entire communities, all in the name of maintaining their power. These locations are key to their operations." I stared at the map, trying to make sense of it. "But why? What's the point of all this?" The figure hesitated, then spoke with a quiet intensity. Control. They believe that by controlling the flow of information, by keeping people in the dark, they can maintain their grip on power. Joe. He found out too much. He was trying to expose them, to break their hold. That's why they targeted him. I felt a chill run through me, not from fear, but from the weight of the realization. Joe hadn't just been a barista with a secret. He'd been part of something much larger, a struggle I'd only just begun to understand. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why am I involved?" "You weren't supposed to be," the figure replied, their tone somber. "But you saw too much. Once you noticed the mark, you became part of the equation. They've been watching you, waiting to see what you'd do." My mind raced, piecing together everything that had happened. The strange men in the coffee shop, the symbols, the van. All of it had been part of the Watchers' surveillance, their way of keeping tabs on anyone who might pose a threat. And now, I was in their sights. "So what happens now?" I asked, trying to keep the panic from creeping into my voice. The figure took a step closer, their presence suddenly more imposing. "Now, you have a choice. You can keep digging, keep fighting, and risk everything. Or you can walk away, forget what you've seen, and live your life. But know this, once you're in, there's no going back." I looked down at the map, at the locations marked in red. It was a choice between ignorance and knowledge, safety and danger. But deep down, I knew there was no real choice. I couldn't walk away. Not after everything I'd seen, everything I knew. Even if it meant putting myself at risk, I had to see this through. "I'm not walking away," I said, my voice firm. "Tell me what I need to do." The figure nodded, almost as if they'd expected my answer. They handed me a small, unmarked key. "This is for a locker at the central bus station. Inside, you'll find everything you need. But be careful. Once you open that locker, there's no turning back." I took the key, feeling its weight in my hand. "And what about you? Who are you?" The figure hesitated for a moment, then pulled back their hood, revealing a face I didn't recognize. Sharp features, dark eyes, a scar running down one cheek. "I'm someone who's been fighting this battle for a long time," they said, their voice softer now. "But my time is almost up. It's your turn now." Without another word, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. I stood there holding the key, the map, and the weight of everything I'd learned. I knew what I had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. The next morning I went to the bus station, my heart pounding as I approached the row of lockers. I found the one that matched the key, took a deep breath, and opened it. Inside was a small worn notebook and a flash drive. I didn't know what I'd find on that drive, but I knew it held the answers I'd been searching for. Back at home, I plugged the drive into my computer and opened the files. What I found was more than I'd ever expected. Documents, recordings, and files detailing the Watchers' operations, their influence over the city, and the lengths they'd go to maintain their control. It was overwhelming, the sheer scale of it all. But there, in the middle of it all, was Joe's name. He'd been right. He'd uncovered something huge, something dangerous, and now it was up to me to decide what to do with it. I knew the risks, the danger of exposing them, but I also knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The world needed to know the truth, and if I didn't do something, who would? So here I am, writing this, knowing that by the time you read it, things might have already changed. Maybe the Watchers will come for me, maybe they won't. But at least now you know. You know what's out there, what's lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Be careful who you trust. Be careful what you look for. Because sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lies that keep us safe. And remember, once you see the mark, it's already too late. This is my last warning, my final act of defiance. Whatever happens next, at least I did what I could. And maybe, Just maybe. That will be enough.